Okay, so the view from above. For the most part, the arguments that come from the developed world are more centered around self-interest type arguments, but they are on a backdrop of a lot of moral issues. So we say, we're not going to reduce emissions because it's going to devastate our economy. But behind that, there's a call to sort of these moral things that you may not see explicitly stated and say by Bill Clinton or by Obama. So efficiency. Developed countries produce more GDP per unit of energy, which also means that they produce more GDP per unit of carbon, right? So I think I have a figure here. So this is a figure from Jameson. Again, it's a little dated. It's 1995. But for the most part, these are pretty accurate. So it's an energy to GDP ratio. So the closer to 1, right, the better. So you can see we're pretty efficient in terms of our energy use and what CO2 that we're emitting. Other countries, not so much. So the argument is, well, if a policy is going to limit the energy production of countries in the developed world, it means we're moving to a more inefficient world, right? So the production is going to happen in these places where it's not as efficient, and that's bad for the world as a whole. Feasibility. So this is, if we reduce emissions or mitigate emissions in some countries, we're just going to move our dirty industries somewhere else. It's just not going to work. If there's countries where emissions can take place unlimited, it's going to happen. And also there's this argument that developing countries will eventually surpass the developed countries in terms of emissions. And so that's what this is showing here. So here's your developing countries, and here's your developed countries. And so eventually, based on models, you can see population growing, and as they develop, you will see more emissions coming from the developing world, which doesn't look good for a policy like Kyoto, right? If you're exempting all developing countries from mitigating. Finally, fairness, because Kyoto only restricts some countries to certain emissions. It's just unfair. It's like having 3 kids and having rules for 2 of them and letting the other one do whatever they want. It's that type of moral claim. And Jameson will say that this efficiency argument is really the most important, because overall, moving to a more inefficient world will be bad for everybody, not just the developed world, but everybody. At least that's how Jameson reasons. View from below, from the developing countries. So the biggest reason, I guess, the developing countries will object to Kyoto is the polluter's pay principle. So developing countries should be responsible for most historical emissions, and then therefore they should lead in mitigating climate change. And this is the biggest argument that you're going to see. And really it makes sense, right? You cause the problem, you should pay for it. We shouldn't have to worry about mitigation. And this sort of backs up that argument. So this is cumulative emissions, and you can see, and maybe it's difficult, so Canada is like the smaller circle, the US is like overwhelming all of this area, European Union. So it's telling you who, historically, over time, who is really responsible for the climate problem. Equity appeal, okay. So the developed countries have resources to respond where the developing countries don't. So economically, yeah, we may be hurt by mitigating, but we're probably not going to hurt our citizens as much as the citizens of a developing country who are at the point where they're not even to a minimum standard of living. So that's the argument there. And you can see that pretty well in this figure. On the top is CO2 emissions per capita. So in red are the countries with higher levels of emissions. Blue is lower. On the bottom, you see vulnerability to climate change. You can see it's almost the direct opposite. And I'll point out, Uganda is in here, really low emissions. Look at their vulnerability. A lot of it, what comes into this is economic factors as well. So they're experiencing negative impacts and they don't have the resources to take away from a lot of these other important things and put towards mitigating climate change. They're worried about feeding their family, And fairness. This appeal is more to necessary emissions versus luxury emissions. And this really goes into equity appeal as well. we're trying to provide meals for our family, necessary emissions like cooking and building schools and hospitals and things are really important in the developing world. You really can't compare them to the emissions of like a Hummer or an SUV or going on vacation, for example. So emissions shouldn't be all created equal. So those are the views that Jameson outlines, and he says that this equality appeal by the developing countries is something that's morally indismissible. This is something that has to be incorporated into any sort of policy that's going to be, be able to come to an international agreement upon. So, after he outlines both sides, he has this list of proposals. And you'll see pretty much this list if you do a review of the literature of different proposals that are out there. You could think about the equivalent of these in TAG. So I've seen these on Ethics Core, right? So if you want to distribute commissions on a per capita basis, this is like saying everyone should get the same grade, maybe even without sharing. So we're all going to produce a certain amount, everyone gets, I think it's like a 70 or something if you do it without sharing. Distribute permissions on the basis of productivity. This is when you say the subsistence player produced everything, the intermediate produced about half, the luxury produced 0. It's based on efficiency because the subsistence players produce the least amount of externalities, right, based on their pollution. So, and then you could trade after that. So that's sort of the analogous situation. This is a little bit harder to apply to TAG, but I think if we were able to play multiple rounds of TAG, this would be something maybe that would apply. It's hard because you guys aren't really like polluting anything right now, right, to judge that on. Some other principle. So, I don't know, you may be able to put the revolt kind of thing under this category. Maybe I think Dvorak had the idea of let's minimize risks. So maybe you could distribute carbon on that sort of basis. So you could fit a lot of other things in here. And then a combination of some of these principles. So Jameson goes through and he reasons 4 and 5 are the last resort. They're not defined. They're not really identified in the literature anyway as being an ethical or just solution. So he kind of crosses these out. He says 3 is just not going to work. No one's going to agree to this. Basically, it says that because you're a developed country, you were lucky enough to industrialize earlier, therefore you should benefit by having the right to emit. So it's sort of like a temporal benefit or something. So he says there's no way, ethically and just, that this can happen. So it leaves these two. Jameson says that number 2 has a pretty good point, right? If we base it on productivity, it's a good thing because we're not moving towards a more inefficient world. We're producing the maximum number of points that can peg, right, and then distributing them. But in the end, he comes to say that really this is the most fair way to approach climate change and how to distribute carbon. So everyone should have the same right to the same amount of carbon, no matter where you're from, no matter what you do. And he says to take care of that number 2, or that efficiency perspective, let's distribute emissions per capita, equal per capita, and then we will make that efficient by implementing a cap and trade system. So just quickly, cap and trade. Basically, if you're a party or if you're a country that produces less than its permitted amount, it can then sell that leftover carbon rights to somebody who's producing more, and you get this trade of money for CO2 permits. So that's the efficiency part, and in the end, you end up with your most efficient producers who are making the most money from producing things will be the ones that are most able to pay for permits, and they will be the ones that are emitting. So we can say, what type of strategy in TAG would stimulate Jameson's proposal? This is something you have to answer in your paper, but I think I've gone through it enough that you can sort of imagine what type of strategy in TAG would really reflect Jameson's proposal. Okay, so he also talks about some caveats of his proposal. Basically says, well, if we distribute CO2 on the basis of equal per capita, then each nation, if you just have a higher population, you'll get more emissions, So he says, well, we'll just address this by indexing the population to a baseline year. He gives the example of 1990. So basically, a country's population in 1990, that's sort of where it's indexed. So you won't have that effect. But there's some other issues. Basically, it gives the developed countries historical emissions for free. So it's taking that cumulative emissions figure that I showed you, and it's saying, all right, we're starting from scratch. We're going to do a forward-looking sort of environmental justice. Basically, if you were smoking for your whole life and then you decide, I'm just going to stop. It's kind of like you're not really making up for all the harms maybe you've caused by secondhand smoking or something. You are just making it right from now on. So Jamieson says, well, people will probably agree to this, even though it's not ideal. 2, it matters where emissions occur. So this comes down to the allocation part. If you supplement an equal per capita distribution, then you have a cap and trade system. In the end, you're allocating emissions to the developed world, basically, the countries that are most efficient with their CO2. Jamieson sort of agrees with Coase on this and says, sure, developed nations and developing nations will be able to work out some sort of agreement where everyone feels like they're well off from the transaction. My dissertation is pretty much looking at how that is not true. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but it's okay if you want to question this one a lot, because there's definitely some caveats with just saying that a general cap and trade or market system will result in voluntary ideal exchanges between nations. And a big part of this is because of that graph that I showed you, right? Greenhouse gas emissions are linked to quality of life. We have evidence to believe that if you're a country that's producing a lot of greenhouse gases, at least on a per capita level, that's transferring into greater human development. So there's problems with saying that some people will be emitting those and others aren't. It also means that developed countries aren't taking the first step. So we're not placing most of the responsibility on the developed nations. And then the big thing is monitoring, enforcement, and compliance. Jamieson just sort of says these are problems and they're going to have to improve in order to have any sort of international climate mitigation plan. So with that, at the end of the chapter, he says, this is a great idea, but it's probably just not going to happen. We're going to turn to adaptation. It's probably going to fall apart. So in a way, he's just saying that this just isn't going to happen. In TEG, you guys aren't going to be able to cooperate. No one's going to listen to one another. And in the end, everyone will end up failing, for example. And so these are pictures from actual climate negotiations. People are really frustrated. It takes a really long time to consider perspectives from everyone. Nobody agrees on exactly how this should happen, and this is the results. And I don't know about you guys, I felt like this a little bit over the weekend. I was dealing with these communication issues and stuff. I was just, oh my God, what are we going to do? So think about this, and maybe some of you guys have kind of felt like this at a time or another when you're playing TEG, and maybe you'll feel that coming up as we continue playing TEG. Okay, so some concluding questions. What I think my presentation focuses on are these 2 questions. And in terms of climate change, these are something that I consider in my research. So what are the developed world's obligations to developing countries? And what should the developed countries risk in their own sense of well-being to meet these obligations? So this is pretty much directly referring to that slide where I have the diminishing returns, CO2 to human development. We show that people in the developed world should be able to reduce their emissions without seeing a huge sacrifice in human development. So what does that mean? Do we have an obligation to do that? So analogously, in TEG, we can say something similar. What are my obligations to fellow students in my class, really, and located in other classes? And what am I willing to risk